Hi everybody, hope you're well and welcome to week 2 of PO3 USF or US Foreign Policy since 1950, possibly the sort of best module this side of the global pandemic. Anyway, it's Saturday morning, which means it's recording time for me here in my beautiful office. So I've got my camera, I've got my slides, and I also have my very tasty coffee. So let's get started, as it were. Anyway, last week we explored some introductory comments on the module that touched on why we should study US foreign policy. We sort of looked at what sort of questions we'll be considering over the course of a module. We also ran through each week's topic and said a few words about each of these. And finally, I tried to say a few useful words about the assessment overall, as it were. Now, this might not have been probably the most captivating or entertaining week on the module, but I feel this sort of introductory session is necessary to sort of set things up in quite a orderly fashion, as it were. But this week we're moving on to our next lecture or set of screencasts, and there are 3 of these, if I can count. Yep, there are 3 of these, where we'll be looking at the historical traditions and debates in US foreign policy. We'll look at a sort of a framework that provides us with a structured way of thinking about what the US seeks to achieve through its foreign policy initiatives. And we'll end with a few words on the ways in which the United States and Europeans view power, foreign policy, and threats, and how they sort of differ from one another, as it were. And it's that I really want us to focus on in the seminars for this week. Hence, this week's central questions are essentially what is foreign policy? The second question we're really interested in is what does the US seek to achieve through its foreign policy, a key question to think about on the module. And finally, I want us to think about how US and European views differ on power and foreign policy. And this gives us, as we've got on the slide here, our 3 weekly learning outcomes, which really sort of map onto those key questions. So those learning outcomes are to better understand what foreign policy is, what we mean by this, to better understand the sort of enduring traditions that course throughout the history of US foreign policy. And finally, and maybe most importantly, to engage with the seminal works of Robert Kagan on how the US views differ on foreign policy, power, and the international system, as it were. So that's kind of what I want us to really take away from this week's set of screencasts. Just a note, for the Robert Kagan reading this week, you'll need to read round about the first 40 pages or so before class, or certainly as much as you can squeeze in during these slightly sort of unconventional weeks of the academic year. And we will be exploring his arguments and views in the seminar. And I will put up before the seminars this week a set of questions that I want us to think about that come out of that reading. So hopefully you'll come to class with a good sense of what it is we want to talk about and think about across this week's seminars, as it were. Well, the starting point for today really should be the question of what foreign policy is at heart. I mean, it's one of those things we talk about a lot, but we need to kind of have at least some sort of working definition and understanding of the term. But I suppose the sort of the first thing to say on this is that US foreign policy defines America's economic, cultural, and military relations with external actors in the international system, such as other states, international organizations, and sub-state groups. And that's quite a useful working definition for us to use for this week's lecture material. I suppose US foreign policy also includes an endless number of decisions that have important implications for the international system. Some small, like defining and negotiating trade rules with maybe South Korea or Brazil, perhaps, to larger decisions such as the attack on Iraqi forces in 1991 after the Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, or maybe Harry S. Truman's decision to use the atomic bombs on Japanese cities in the sort of a latter or closing stages of World War II. As we know, I think it's fair to say that American policies have certainly changed the world, but many of these have also boomeranged back and changed the US in a domestic sense too. For example, if we think about Black American soldiers who fought for their country and certain freedoms during maybe World War II, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, these were essentially then, forced into sort of racial segregation when they returned home to the United States and were essentially denied the very freedoms that they were fighting for abroad, as it were. I mean, why would you be kind of happy to go and fight for those freedoms abroad whilst you're denied them at home in a domestic sense? So in many ways, this should come as no surprise. But it's these sorts of experiences that led, or at least contributed, I should say, to the civil rights movements of the 1960s across the United States. So that separation of US foreign policy from domestic politics isn't always quite so clear cut, as it were. We could also maybe think about the experiences of World War II and how it convinced the US to take a lead in the sort of a Western or maybe even global fight against communism during the Cold War. Yet again, this sort of experience impacted the US in a domestic sense, as many, as we move into the late 1940s and 1950s, accused each other of being communists during what was known as the Red Scare that kind of coursed from around about 1945 through to maybe about 1960, as it were. And finally, the bottom point I have on a slide here is that we may also say that US foreign policy is a reflection of American values and is therefore an existential example to the world of what the US just stands for, as it were. As such, how America acts on the world stage helps to answer the question of who are we? When Americans ask that question, or the United States collectively ask that question of who are we, foreign policy always sort of provides an answer, as it were, because what the US does around the world essentially broadcasts what the US stands for. Now, on one hand, this may be democracy, it may be liberty and capitalism, but also war, perhaps a sort of the increasing militarization of domestic policing, and perhaps an acceptance of violence as a way of life. And certainly that's a kind of a theme that we'll maybe touch on a little bit as we progress through the module. Now, of course, all states in the international system have goals that they wish to secure, what we essentially tend to call the national interest. And the US is absolutely no different here at all. All countries tend to seek a degree of power, a degree of prosperity, usually peace, but certainly not always, and the exploitation of certain principles and values to other states and hence around the world and into the broader international system. For much of this week, it's these four values that I wish to explore from an American perspective, as it tells us much about what foreign policy essentially is for. It's not a question we often think about, but what really is foreign policy for when we think about it in these specific terms. But this is what Bruce Gentleson calls the 4 Ps framework, as we have on the slide here, and it's this sort of framework that we'll be working through. Now, these 4 Ps are not sort of strict categories per se, and US policies, I should say, aren't always defined by just one of these, as they sort of often overlap with each other. They often sort of exist in tension with each other too, and a good example here is when George W. Bush took the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 and essentially took the US to war in the Middle East. Now, this arguably enhanced American power and security. They never had another attack after 9/11. It also perhaps led to more democracy in the Middle East, so an exportation of a core American value, even if this was utterly imperfect. But at the same time, it also decreased the level of peace in the world, and it cost the US a great deal of money, sort of hindering its global prosperity, as it were, and perhaps also negatively impacting on the US's sort of global standing. So quite often, although this framework is a useful way of thinking about foreign policy, quite often, as I say, these sort of principles are quite often in tension with one another. But in short, I think they should really be thought about as the central reoccurring themes of US foreign policy that largely characterize the country's worldview. Whether this makes US foreign policy realist, liberal, capitalist, or imperialist is certainly up for debate, but in truth, it's probably often all of these things at the same time, even if the respective strength of each of these themes waxes and wanes over time and from administration to administration. Either way, let's now take some time to say a few words about each element of this 4Ps framework and work through each one of these in turn. So the first element of our framework is that of power, usually understood as military power in terms of foreign policy. Now, in terms of IR theory or international relations theory, this is largely a realist position and relates to the chapter in or one of the chapters from the reading that I've assigned this week by Colin Dweck, called Conservative American Realism. And given what we looked at last week on the sort of the sheer weight and size of the US military, I suppose this has to be our starting point, as it is really the sort of the standout feature or element of the United States in terms of its sort of exceptional nature in international relations. Now, as you'll recall, the US generally spends around the same on its military budget as the next 10 countries combined, which is certainly impressive or perhaps terrifying, depending on your perspective or standpoint. But I suppose from this perspective, in a sort of an intellectual sense, has to be the key requirement for most basic foreign policy goals, such as the defense of the homeland, the preservation of national independence, and the maintenance of national territory and the protection, certainly, of international allies, such as those maybe within NATO. And Samuel Huntington captures this well when he writes, "Power enables an actor to shape his environment so as to reflect his interests. In particular, it enables a state to protect its security and prevent, deflect, or defeat threats to that security." As most of you will instantly recognize, this insight and assumption really is drawn from the realist school of thought in international relations that simply assumes that military power is the base currency of all international relations. And the US is an excellent example here, as it were. Of course, this logic sort of relies on that timeless lesson of realism that paints the international system in a somber sort of Hobbesian sense, or in Hobbesian terms, a sort of a reference to Thomas Hobbes, the classic realist thinker. And that is a sort of an anarchic world of a sort of a war against, a war of all against all, I should say, where conflict and competition for power, influence, resources and territory is the basic reality of all international relations. And essentially, just to reiterate that point, this is what we call the realist tradition in US foreign policy, and indeed in broader international relations terms. But I think this worldview is probably best expressed by John Mearsheimer. I've got a copy of his book on the slide here, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics from 2003. But Mearsheimer writes, international relations is not a constant state of war, but is a state of relentless security competition, with a possibility of war always in the background. Cooperation among states has its limits, mainly because it's constrained by the sort of dominating logic of security competition, which no amount of cooperation can eliminate. Genuine peace, or a world where states do not compete for power, is not likely. And I think that's quite a useful quote to summarize this this aspect of the 4Ps framework. Now, this emphasis on military power and realism may seem aggressive and warlike, and it often is, but this isn't necessarily so, or at least not always from an American perspective. And this is a really important thing to note on the module, but I think in sort of intellectual terms in a broader sense. And this is that the US's subjective experience of the international system and indeed international politics will often differ from our own. But simply judging the US from your own position or perspective really won't make you a better student of American foreign policy. Engaging with the subjective sort of will or view of others will, even if you don't really like its content or what that subjectivity implies, as it were. So at this point, I really do need to stress that even if we are wary of an overly sort of militarized state, we still need to try to engage with the logic and the base sort of subjectivity of that particular state. So be sure to keep that in mind on the module. So what is this level of power for in the American context and in the American perspective? Well, first, and as noted above, it really is about the defense of the homeland, the US's interests abroad, and the protection of international allies. And I think this is all quite straightforward enough. But there is also a sort of a deeper belief here, as it were, that and Ronald Reagan captured this quite well throughout the 1980s. Ronald Reagan being the president, giving an address here on the slide. But such an overwhelming amount of power gives the US, or provides the US, the ability to maintain peace through strength, a key term that we'll come back to on the module a few times. In other words, the sheer power of the US means that it's able to enforce a relatively peaceful international system when compared to the historical past. And this is a claim that so many presidents, particularly Republican presidents, tend to stress in their speeches, and goes right away through back through time to presidents of the early 20th century, such as Theodore Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt, as he was quite often called. And here's a link on the slide here from Reagan, if you want to kind of have a look at this sort of logic and this sort of narrative. But just a word of warning, and it's a sort of this gets at an assumption that many of my students make as they come into this module, and they presume that Democratic presidents are more peaceful than Republicans, as it were. Yeah, I just want to caution against that sort of assumption. And if we think about World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, all of these were undertaken by Democratic presidents. And Democrats are essentially, at least in historical terms, the party that have pushed more greatly or more forcefully for foreign intervention. So try not to think about the US's sort of propensity to go to war or to use its military power as something that is Republican or per se. It really is something that both parties are likely to go along with. I think another useful point to raise here, and as Colin Dweck also argues at length in one of the readings on the list for this week, is that much of this is about the maintenance of American primacy, or the amount of the American power that it has is about the maintenance of American primacy. In other words, and as Dweck writes, American primacy refers to a set of interlocking conditions in which the United States retains more broad-based economic and military capabilities than any other major power, along with a greater ability than any rival to shape the international environment. Primacy is a circumstance and an interest, not a strategy. In the case of the United States, however, primacy is also a historical reality dating back to the end of World War II. Now, this is important as so many Americans, including ordinary folk, politicians, academics, and journalists argue that US strength is vital for a more peaceful and prosperous world. This is a point we'll come back to in a little while, and it's one of the central questions on the module, but it's also something that we'll discuss in the seminars later on this week, I hope, if we get to this point. But put briefly, American primacy allows the US to export its values and political models around the world that for many leads to a more prosperous and peaceful world. And this is what Robert Kagan is getting at to some degree in many of his works that we'll look at across the module. I suppose a third and final point we need to think about is how this amount of power gives the US immense influence on the world stage, and hence has the power to influence international organizations such as the United Nations and NATO. It gives the US immense coercive power or leverage with most states, but certainly not all. I suppose North Korea and Iran are clear examples here. And it also allows the US to easily prevent other countries from acting against its wishes and interests. And a good example here, a good historical example at least, is the Suez Crisis of 1956. Now, this was an event that saw the UK, France and Israel essentially manufacture a crisis in Egypt so they would have an excuse to invade the country and take control of the vital waterway that is the Suez Canal, which essentially connects the Mediterranean with the oil-rich regions of the Middle East. And it also was a sort of a shortcut to India and Pakistan that the British and the French were keen to keep these corridors open, as it were. Now, these three countries did this without informing the American president, who would certainly not have sanctioned this sort of action. And President Eisenhower, president at the time in 1956, was not at all pleased. And he essentially threatened all three countries with economic sanctions of some sort and some kind, which meant all had to comply with the US's wishes and essentially bring the sort of shameful episode to an end without any military action at all. It really was just the power and the might of the United States and its economic power as well that essentially enabled the US to force the UK, France, and Israel to comply with its wishes. Either way, this sort of the extent of American power gives the US military an exceptionally high standing at home in a domestic sense. And here, as we can see from data from 2018 on the slide, that the US military was by far the most trusted and respected major institution in the country. And that it was certainly trusted more than Congress or the presidency. And you see Congress, its standing in the US back in 2018, just having an 11% approval rating, where the US military having essentially a 74% approval rating. And this tells us just how much this side of this, the amount of American power and the US military is seen in a positive light across just about all 50 states of the American Union. However, and just to bring this up to date for the module, there is now perhaps a sense that the US is, although it's often felt almost invulnerable behind its powerful navy, its air force and its army, and it really is blessed by its geographical position in the international system, the country is perhaps now losing its sense of being invulnerable, and that it sort of enjoyed for much of the 20th century. And I suppose the 9/11 attack sort of shattered this image to some degree, but with the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis also ravaging the country during 2020, perhaps this gloss may be wearing off to some degree. And there is a nice article a recent article in the Rolling Stone magazine, which looks at this sort of perspective, and there's a link to this on the slide here, and also talks about the unraveling of the United States and maybe the waning of the American era, as it were. So take a look at this in your own time if you're interested in this. Just from my own perspective, I'm not too sure I agree with this analysis. Largely because the US has faced so many significant challenges in the past. and this sort of narrative American decline is something that is constant in the literature. But at least have a look at this article and maybe have a look at what you kind of make of this, as I say, in your own time. Okay, as we move on to our final slide now, and given that this screencast is running towards 25 minutes, I plan for it to be just 20. I'm going to wrap this one up now. When we come back into our second screencast of the week, we'll look at some elements of the other 4Ps framework before moving on to the reading by Robert Kagan. So my voice is going on me now right at the end. So either take a break from all of this, or all things US foreign policy, or just move right on to the next screencast and keep on watching. Either way, stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you all soon for the second screencast of this week.